act of genocide. However, this did not happen immediately. It was only 20 years later, in 1965, on the 50th anniversary of the Armenian genocide, on the 24th of April, which is long recognized as the symbolic date of the massacres of 1915, that the two elements were associated. That is, recognition and genocide. Recognition of the Armenian genocide. This moment marked the start of a movement which continued unabated and became unstoppable, because it entails the whole identity, memory, and suffering of the Armenian people, now channeled into the effort to achieve recognition of the Armenian genocide, which may also be termed genocide of the Armenians.
Who demanded the term genocide be used and how?
I think that this developed within Armenian organizations, in the diaspora, and in Soviet Armenia. After the death of Stalin, we saw the seeds of a desire for liberation in Soviet Armenia, and this question was evoked. On April the 24th, 1965, throughout the Armenian diaspora and in Soviet Armenia, thousands of people marched in the streets. More than 100,000 in Soviet Armenia, an extraordinary occurrence for a country of 3 million inhabitants under communist rule. And there was no specific repression as a result, to demand their independence and their land. At first, these demands were formulated in global terms: independence, recognition, and land. Armenians wanted the return of what had been stolen from them: land, money, other property. And they demanded that Turkey acknowledge the crime committed. It is clear that Turkey was taken somewhat by surprise by this movement, orchestrated in France, for example, by an organization of the Dashnak party, Dashnak Sutyun. The Armenian Revolutionary Federation, called the Committee for the Defense of the Armenian Cause. It was formed in 1965 and still in existence, and it was the first structure in France to demand recognition of the Armenian genocide. Turkey did not expect this flood of demands, and it reacted by gradually creating a true disinformation laboratory to re-examine all the documents, to reproduce some of them in a bid to prove the absence of intention to commit genocide. On the one hand, there was pressure from the Armenians, and on the other, Turkey's intention to respond, which is normal. And their explanation could only be provided through a fallacious interpretation of history. This interpretation would form the basis of what is now known as revisionism, which should be understood in the sense of the negation of genocide. The word was coined initially to describe Holocaust denial, but the term has been expanded, with the approval of most historians, to include specific phenomena such as the Armenian genocide. Thus, this revisionist view was elaborated and structured bit by bit on the basis of the responsibility of the Armenian people. And here we arrive at the essence of the crime of genocide. To commit genocide, the murderer must define the victim as being responsible for something. This initial guilt of the victim then becomes the motive for an act that is inevitable, as the victim is perceived as the threat.
De l'action qui est inévitable puisque on perçoit la victime comme une menace.
When a threat becomes critical, It is us or them. If we don't kill them, they'll kill us. If we don't destroy them, our dream of Turkishness will evaporate. So there you see how the young Turks and the Turkish people came to the conclusion that extreme measures were required, which were not defined as genocide, but as a massacre, like other massacres of the time, because the responsibility lay with the Armenians themselves, because they were revolutionaries, because they formed an independent state, because this or that.
So they were the traitors.
But none of this is true. The Armenians only reacted to persecution, and this is what I try to show in my book on the innocence of victims, an original innocence in the dual sense that they are not guilty, they have done nothing wrong, and that they are not dangerous, not harmful, they do no harm. So a victim has to be fabricated. The young Turks' imagination fabricated the Armenian victim based on several factors, including the existence of the Armenian revolutionary movement, which is of course an acknowledged fact. A few Armenian terrorist actions which, although a reality, were always in response to events. Like the Van uprising, a movement of self-defense. Thus, genocide requires the perpetrator to find a pretext for killing a group of people who are judged to be guilty, whereas in reality they have done nothing. The revisionist argument centers on this idea of Armenian guilt, whereas the Armenians acted only to protect themselves. But the argument is reversed to claim that the Armenians threatened Turkey, and therefore they had to be fought. The events are presented as a war, a combat in a situation of war against the enemy within, which is completely untrue.
So when did this claim of genocide start to be countered?
The problem developed as Armenian initiatives grew. I think there were two important milestones during the 1970s. One of these was the fact that, by chance, a subcommission of the Commission on Human Rights requested a report on genocide, curiously enough, assigned to a Rwandan delegate, Ruhashianiko. This report mentioned the Armenians as genocide, using documentation which at the time was absurd, as he didn't even use the documents available. But there was a general outcry from the Turkish representatives on the subcommission, and paragraph 30 of the report, mentioning the Armenian genocide as genocide, was scrapped. The refusal to recognize their tragedy as genocide was a slap in the face to the Armenians. At the same time, revisionist actions were gradually taking shape to counter each Armenian initiative. For example, a small memorial to the 1,500,000 Armenian victims of genocide was built in 1973 in a private church in Marseille on the Prado, and still stands today, which caused a diplomatic storm culminating in the Turkish ambassador breaking off diplomatic relations with France, at least in his departure from France. At this point, Armenian exasperation reached terrifying proportions. They wanted the world to recognize what had happened. They won a kind of veto from Turkey in all bodies, where she could express it. This marked a new phase, both a tragedy and an awakening, which was the Armenian terrorist movement, active from 1977 to 1982. At this time, we witnessed a dual phenomenon characterized by a growing awareness on the part of the Armenians that this violence made people listen to them, made people hear them. They were spoken of in the media.
What form did this violence take?
Attacks and murders aimed at Turkish